Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to speak in this seminar series. I guess I'm doubly lucky because my co-author, Amy Finkelstein, presented joint work a couple weeks ago. And so you may be getting sick of me. I think all people have decreasing returns, but hopefully the marginal benefit is still above the marginal cost. So let me screen share. This is a new paper, of course, so hopefully it won't be too second. Great. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, it's okay.
Yes. Great. So this is joint work with Ben Keyes. We started this project when Ben Keyes was at Harris University of Chicago, probably over 5 years ago. He's now at Wharton. And Hanbin Yang, who was originally a sort of full-time research assistant working with me at Chicago Booth, and is now a PhD student at Harvard. And so the motivation for this paper, and I think a broader motivation of a strand of my research, is understanding consumer financial distress and consumer financial distress in the United States in particular. And the reason why I think this is a intellectually interesting and important line of research is because financial distress in the United States is very high. So some statistics in absolute levels among people with a credit report, which is about 90% of adults, 34% have at least one debt in collections. So a debt in which there's a collections company that could be coming after them to try and recover. 5% of adults have declared bankruptcy in the last 7 years. And it's hard to find exact apples to apples comparisons to, I think, illustrate the magnitude of these statistics. But if you use comparable survey data, so if you take the SCF and the SILK in Europe, for example, you see huge differences between the US and Europe. So in the US, in the survey of consumer finances, 20% are late on their debt payments. In Europe, on average, these are comparable years, sort of before the start of the financial crisis. The values are 1/5 or 1/10 as high. Other cuts of the data, other data sources will give you similarly large differences. So this paper is not going to try and understand why the US is different from Europe, but is going to try and start shining a light on why financial distress is so high in the US. And the way we're going to try and make progress is to examine differing levels, patterns in financial distress across areas in the United States. And so to help us undertake this endeavor, so when I was at Chicago Booth worked with TransUnion. It's one of the 3 sort of credit bureaus in the United States to get access to credit records on 10% of sort of all people in their data. So this is about 35 million individuals over a 17-year period. It is the largest, or basically tied for the largest, sort of individual level credit report data set made available to researchers. And we got excited about this project because we thought the first right project to do with this data would at least start by establishing some facts. And so what this paper does is establish some facts and then goes on to try and understand them. And so the facts that we establish, the key outcomes that we're going to focus on in this analysis is what we think of as three broadly representative measures of financial distress. We are going to look at sort of the fraction of people with debt and collections, or the amount of debt and collections. Like I said, it's about 35%. We're going to look at the fraction of people who are behind on their credit card payments. So that's not, and I need to sort of calibrate how much institutional detail I provide here, because I don't know what financial products are familiar to the audience and which ones are not. So with a credit card in the US, you have monthly minimum payments. And as long as you pay at least the minimum, which is something like 2% of the bill, then you're on time on your credit card. You're still accumulating debt, you're still borrowing. And so our metric is going to be people who don't even make a minimum payment. And then the final metric is going to be looking at people who declare personal bankruptcy. And personal bankruptcy is basically where you walk away from your debts, but in exchange, your creditors can either claim your assets, so your cars, money in savings accounts, sometimes the value of your home, depending upon the state, or you work out a payment plan with them. So in some senses, similar to corporate bankruptcy, but the specifics are quite different. So we're going to focus on these metrics. I think the reason why we decided to focus on these metrics is we wanted metrics that provide us the broadest possible window into the population. So for example, if you look at people who default on their auto loans, you're going to condition on people who have cars. People who have cars tend not to live in New York City. People in Colorado tend to have multiple cars. And so a lot of patterns you see will be driven by product ownership. The metrics we focus on, they still, obviously, you need a credit card to default on a credit card, but 70+% of people have a credit card. So they are more broadly representative. So that was our focus, but certainly not our only interest in this space. All right. So, the first fact, and I will provide additional evidence of this sort as we go, is there are large persistent geographic differences in financial distress across the United States, in particular in the Deep South. So that's going to be, I guess I can show you this area with my mouse. The fraction of people with a debt and collections is almost twice what it is in the upper Midwest area of the United States. I think those are where you see the biggest differences. These patterns may actually look familiar if you recall sort of maps from Raj Chetty about upward mobility. You see similar patterns or if you looked at maps of like life expectancy in the United States, you would see similar patterns. So there are persistent issues in the South of the United States, and financial distress is another example. So this is what we're first going to do. We're going to document large persistent geographic disparities. And then there are, of course, many explanations for financial distress. And so what we're going to do in this project is you can think about bucketing explanations in two categories. So one category is local, institutional, and economic factors. So this could be state laws which govern the supply of debt, the ability to declare bankruptcy, could be shocks to the local economy, which depress people's wages and therefore lead to financial distress. We'll think about those as place-based factors. On the other hand, there could be a host of individual characteristics that give rise to financial distress. So these could be preference parameters, discount rates, risk preferences, stigma around debt and default. Could be behavioral factors like inattention or financial literacy. It could be capital, human capital, or wealth. And so the second, and I think major part of the paper is going to use a movers research design, which you may or may not be familiar with, but there's sort of been an explosion of work using movers designs to quantify the relative importance of place versus person-based factors in explaining differences in financial distress. And so, roughly speaking, I will show you much more econometrics. We'll talk about threats to validity as we go. Roughly speaking, a mover's design is going to ask what happens to financial distress when somebody moves from a place with low financial distress to high financial distress, for example. If their financial distress rates jump, that's going to indicate, or it is consistent with, something about the place determining financial distress. If somebody's financial distress rates are invariant to their local environment, that's going to be consistent with person-based factors being the major determinant of financial distress. And so our methodology is under a number of assumptions, so we can argue about, is going to quantify the relative importance of place-based factors and person-based factors. Okay, so what are we—
Sorry. Hi. Yeah,
Don't
just
start.
a question. So So these movers are moving during the financial crisis, right?
So our baseline specification is going to use people who move between 2004 to 2007, in particular because we don't want to think about forced moves during the financial crisis. If we use a longer time horizon, our results don't change materially. So I think I think what you're getting at is the main threat to validity here is going to be some unobserved factor which prompts people to move, let's say, to a place with worse financial distress, and also directly impacts their outcome. And
that's your identification problem, right? Yeah,
exactly. So the place where we're going to have to do a lot of work and where you can withhold your judgment until I show you what we do is to argue that our moves provide a reasonable source of variation in these place-based factors.
So essentially these movers are not moving inside the financial crisis. So they're moving before. So
I will show you that these movers basically are on parallel trends prior to the moves. I'll use subsets of the variation, which will control for potential threats to validity. I will use different time periods. I will use a whole bunch of different approaches. But that will be ultimately, I think, what the paper lives and dies on is whether at the end of the day you believe that assumption.
Yeah, okay. So another question is regarding that graph you have about the geographical disparity. So can you explain a little bit why in the South it's quite serious, like default on a credit card? It's credit card default, right?
That one I think is debt and collection. I will show you that it's consistent across a whole bunch of outcomes. I mean, I think the whole point of the paper is we don't know why. And so, this paper is saying, if you remember the line from Braveheart, right? The problem with Scotland is it's full of Scots. The question here is the problem with the South, it's full of Southerners. Or if you take Southerners out of the South, would they have different outcomes? Right? Is it something about the preferences, the financial literacy of people living in the South, or is it something about the economy, the laws of the supply of credit?
So it's more like a place fixed effect, which has an effect on the movers towards these areas, right?
Well, I guess you've already read this slide. Maybe you even saw the abstract of the paper, but I haven't told you what we find yet.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Good. So I should say thank you for the questions. It's when you're presenting on Zoom, you don't get as much audience interaction. So I think it's especially nice when people, participate in a Zoom seminar. Okay, so what are we going to find? For the debt and collection and credit card measures, we're going to find very small place-based effects. So basically, when you move somebody from a place with good outcomes to bad outcomes, their outcomes don't get worse. If you move someone in the opposite direction, they don't change as well. So that's going to be consistent with person-based factors, preferences, financial literacy, behavioral factors being a major determinant of outcomes. In contrast, for personal bankruptcy, we're going to find fairly large place-based effects. If you move to a place with high bankruptcy rates, that your probability of filing for bankruptcy is going to increase substantially. To shed some light on mechanisms, I'm going to show you that there are fairly large asymmetries, in particular for chapter 13. Basically, if you move to a place with higher rates, your bankruptcy rate is going to increase. If you move to a place with lower rates, they're not going to decrease. That sort of asymmetry is consistent with some informational model. If you go to a place with high bankruptcy, you learn about bankruptcy, right? There are billboards on the side of the highway, there are ads on the radio, you hear about it from your friend. If you move to a place with low bankruptcy, you don't unlearn what you already knew, right? And so there's work by Manuel Saiz and Raj Chetty investigating sort of responses to taxation, also showing this sort of asymmetry and interpreting it as an informational model. I think that's our preferred interpretation as well. It's consistent with, there's a body of evidence in legal journals. In fact, this is, Warren here is Elizabeth Warren. So this is Elizabeth Warren's probably most well-known line of research, which is all about the importance of lawyer networks and legal traditions in personal bankruptcy. So it's all about how there are important institutional place-based determinants, and our evidence is consistent with that. Great. So with that motivation, so a couple implications of these results before I actually go through and present things in detail. There is a large literature, including work by myself and my co-authors, which has examined the role of local institutional factors, state laws, local lending practices on credit market outcomes. Our statistically significant place-based effects are consistent with this literature. But what has been, I think, a big revelation for us is, with the exception of bankruptcy, place-based factors only quantitatively account for a small share of geographic disparities. And so in understanding financial distress in the United States, I think we need to, as researchers, focus more on individual characteristics in explaining the observed levels of financial distress. So that's what we've taken away from this endeavor. And this is an hour-and-a-half seminar, just to make sure that I'm going at the right speed. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so data, let me give a sort of a little bit lengthier description of how credit reporting and credit report data works in the US. Basically, there are 3 credit bureaus in the United States: TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian. And the way that they work is that basically banks provide them with information on, for example, credit card balances, whether people default, and then the credit bureaus package this information and sell it back to all the banks. And so not 100%, but most forms of financial distress are then measured in these credit reports. The 3 credit bureaus have very similar information. So we're working with TransUnion. I think the CEO is a Chicago Booth alum. Like I said, we have 10% sample. The way the sample was constructed, I think, was quite clever. They started with 10% of the population in year 2000. People drop out of the sample because they die, because they leave the US. to maintain a representative sample, they just add 10% of people who have a new credit report each month. So that makes the sample representative. We're going to drop individuals outside of ages of 20 to 80 or with missing age information. There's basically two forms of data in credit reports. There's individual level information. We observe zip code, age, bankruptcies, which are public records, your credit score, information on your credit card balance across all accounts. And then we observe account level information. So like your limit or your balance on a specific card, a specific collection item, the date that it was incurred, how much is left, and so on and so forth. Okay, so like I said, we're going to focus on these three primary measures of financial distress. The idea was to have a broad window. So debt and collections. So this is just whether you have at least one debt that's being collected on. Debt and collections can sit on your credit report for up to 7 years. After 7 years, they're automatically removed. They're also removed if you pay your debt and collection. We're going to drop small debts because they're also ignored by in the credit scores. Collectors might not even go after them because they're not worth their effort. We'll look at medical and non-medical debt separately. We'll look at balances. Another measure we construct is, are you behind on your credit card? And that's going to be either, have you not paid in 30 plus days, or has that credit card been charged off by the bank? It's basically measuring financial distress from the perspective of the customer. Once the credit card is charged off, it's not a liability on the bank's asset sheet. So it's not sort of financial distress from the bank's perspective. And then we're going to look at personal bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is much more rare in the United States, so we're going to look at averages over the previous 3 years. This is just going to give us less noise when we construct sort of local area measures. All right, so summary statistics. I already told you that financial distress is high in the US, but here are some more statistics. About 1 in 3 people have a debt in collections. Over 1 in 5 have at least one medical debt in collections, and about 1 in 4 have one non-medical debt in collections. The average balance unconditionally is $1,400. So if you divide that by the 34%, you get that the average balance conditional on having debt in collections is, can I do math fast enough, closer to $4,200. Here I'm also showing you the unconditional medical and non-medical debt balances. So high levels of financial distress. I should say this is from 2016. No, it's from June 2015, which is when the economy was in a relatively good position. We'd recovered from the financial crisis, obviously, before COVID hit. So this is sort of baseline levels of financial distress. Here are some statistics on being non-current on your credit card. About 12% are not current. If you condition on having a card, it jumps up to 17%. Here are the bankruptcy rates in the past 3 years per 1,000 people. Roughly, what's this? 1.5% of people are declaring bankruptcy every 3 years, so about 0.5% per year. This was a little bit higher before bankruptcy reform in 2005. Okay, so I won't spend a lot of time with this, but I do want to mention that we did this exercise. When we first calculated these statistics, even though we knew financial distress was high in the US, we still had trouble believing the numbers. And so we spent a lot of time cross-checking it with other publicly available data sources. And again, you can't always do apples to apples comparisons because other people haven't calculated the statistics you find most interesting. But through any comparison we've done, we think our results are sort of in line with what the New York Fed or the Urban Institute has found. And so, we trust these numbers. We were first users of the data, so it was important for us to do this exercise. Okay, so summary statistics. So here are some geographic patterns. Here's the percent with 1+ debt and collections, sort of 40% in the deep south, 20% or less in the upper Midwest. Sheboygan, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce that right, Wisconsin was the area which had the least financial distress, I think, at some point when we ran the data. And so actually don't know why, but presumably it's due to person-based factors. All right, so here are patterns for medical and non-medical debt and collections, very similar. Once you start slicing and dicing the data, you get outliers in places like North Dakota, where outcomes can be driven, averages can be driven by the tails. I wouldn't overinterpret that. So here are, here are some more statistics. Across most of these measures, outcomes are basically twice as bad in the Deep South than in the upper Midwest. Similar, but maybe less striking patterns for credit card distress. Again, higher credit card distress levels in the South, but you also see in the West, in Nevada and California, much better outcomes in the upper Midwest. And here are some numbers that go along with it. Again, these comparisons, these differences are sort of 50% higher conditional on a credit card, closer to 80% higher. The one metric which looks very different is bankruptcy, and that's because there are two basically chapters of the bankruptcy code in the United States. 70% of personal bankruptcies are under Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is where you give up your debts, and in exchange you give up your assets above exemption limits in your state of residence. So this might be giving up some home equity in your home, giving up your savings, might be giving up a second car. Chapter 7 bankruptcies actually are very high in this sort of region, which is roughly aligned with what people would call the Rust Belt. So this is Detroit auto manufacturing, so lots of rust, but also moving south through where a lot of the auto suppliers were down into Tennessee. Whereas in contrast, you see Chapter 13 is sort of the bankruptcy chapter of choice in the Deep South. And these were the types of maps that Elizabeth Warren and her co-authors were thinking about in the late 90s when they were trying to understand, why do some people declare Chapter 13? Why do some people declare Chapter 7? And they were interviewing clerks at bankruptcy courts and trying to understand differences in legal culture, differences in institutions, and writing that up as law review papers. And so it's not our comparative advantage to talk to lawyers and try and codify what they say, but our analysis will be, take somebody, let's say, from California, send them to Memphis, Tennessee, and ask, do their bankruptcy rates skyrocket? And they do. Here are the differences. But I think the maps are more interesting than the tables. So, one thing that we were curious about when we saw these results are these geographic patterns, just features of the fact we were looking at 2015 data, or are they persistent features of geographic area? So I think, a lot of people who study financial distress are focused on the time series. And clearly there are big time series patterns. But what's interesting to us is that these geographic patterns are quite stable. So what these plots are showing is I'm showing the rank correlation. So I'm taking every commuting zone in the US. There are 741 commuting zones. So there are areas where, as the name implies, people sort of commute for jobs. So collections of something like 5 counties on average. And I'm plotting their rank in terms of financial distress in 2001 and in 2015. And so what you see, for debt and collections, for credit card non-current, these rank correlations are, 0.89, 0.75. Basically, if you had a high level in the beginning of the time period, you have a high level 15 years later. For bankruptcy, the correlations are only 0.55 and 0.72. I think that's due to two reasons. One, there's a big bankruptcy reform. And two, bankruptcy filings are probably more closely connected to the housing market. And we know that sort of shocks to the housing market have not been persistent over time. There's been some places that were really hit hard, for example, during the financial crisis, even though during other times they had very strong housing markets. But my view of this is these are very persistent features of these different places. All right, so given these facts, the main body of the paper then tries to understand, is it person or place? If you take a Southerner out of the South, will their outcomes get better? If you take somebody from Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and send them to Atlanta, will their outcomes get worse? What does that tell us about the underlying causes? Where should we focus our attention if we want to understand what's going on? So, to do this, we're going to use a movers research design. And to implement the movers research design, we're going to zoom in to what we think is a sort of clean sample. So first thing we're going to do is, motivated by the commuting zone level variation, which I showed you before, we're going to focus on individuals who move across commuting zones. So we want people to make sort of big moves, from Wisconsin to Atlanta or vice versa. The second thing we're going to do is, for our baseline analysis, is focus on moves between 2004 and 2007. And the main reason we do this is we want to be able to observe a pre-period. We want to observe whether people were on trends prior to a move, because that's going to be indicative that our research design is poor. And this gives us 4 years of pre-period. And we're going to want to look at a long enough post-period, because we think that the effects of place take a while to seep in. And so this is going to give us an 8-year post-period. You'll basically see that effects converge after about 6 years. And so we obviously chose this by looking at the data and deciding what's a big enough post-period to give us convergence. We will also look, a convenience of this is it avoids the financial crisis, where, as you pointed out, there were some forced moves, which we think is problematic, but the results are qualitatively similar if we use a larger window, which indicates to us that forced moves aren't large enough to bias our estimates. So we're going to look at people who are between 30 and 80 years old in the last period, so that they were at least 18 when they moved. The resulting sample, we have a big data set. So the resulting sample is big, and it sort of needs to be big for things like bankruptcy, which are only happen 1.5% base rate every 3 years. But as you'll see, I think this is enough power for this analysis. All right. So a little bit of econometric setup. And I should say the approach we're taking here follows pretty closely off the prior literature using movers design. So there's a paper by, I'm going to get the order of the authors right, Finkelstein, Getzkow, and Williams, which is using a similar approach to understand variation in healthcare costs. They've also done work on mortality. Our approach is similar. Chetty and co-authors have used movers to sort of estimate the importance of neighborhoods in upwards mobility, sort of similar research design. I can talk about where our research design diverges from other people. But so if you haven't seen this sort of research design, hopefully this will be sort of a good general introduction to this approach. So why IT is an outcome for individual I in time period T, where T is going to be measured in calendar quarters. So like Q1 of 2014. R is going to be event time, where R equals 0 indicates the last quarter prior to the move. And I should have said, but I forgot to say, we're going to focus on people, not only people who move across commuting zones, but we're going to only look at people who move once. And that's just because multiple moves mean that then people sort of in the post period are moving again, and it complicates the analysis. We could write down a specification that deals with it, but it would be more difficult to explain. It would be more difficult to show graphs based upon that specification. Right? So R is event time relative to the single move for these people. And then delta is going to be our measure of the size of the move, which is going to be the difference in average outcomes for non-movers in a destination and an origin. So suppose my outcome is bankruptcy, then delta is going to be average bankruptcy rates of people who don't move in my destination minus average bankruptcy rates for people who don't move in my origin. So a large value of delta is going to indicate I'm moving to a place where the people who've lived there the whole time have higher bankruptcy rates. A negative value of delta is going to be I'm moving to places where the people who've lived there the whole time have lower bankruptcy rates. All right, so delta is going to be the difference. So in our baseline specification, we are going to construct a delta for each individual based upon the movers and non-movers in their origin and destination zip codes. So I just moved from Chicago to Stanford. You take all the people who lived in Hyde Park in Chicago, you take their average outcomes, take all the people who live in Stanford, the difference is my delta. Because of our sample size, I think we probably have enough power. So a concern is some measurement error in delta. I think we have enough power with delta at that, or with measurement at that level, but we're going to examine robustness to using broader geographic regions and then also using finer measures. Okay, so given that setup, what's our estimating equation? YIT is an outcome. We're going to regress that on individual fixed effects, year and quarter fixed effects, event time fixed effects, so that's alpha R. And then this thing in square brackets, this is the size of the move. And then this is a coefficient on the size of the move, which we're going to allow to flexibly vary over time. We're going to normalize this coefficient in the quarter prior to the move. And with this interpretation, a delta of 1 in the post period is going to indicate full convergence. That is, if you move to a place, let's say with a 2% higher bankruptcy rate, coefficient of 1 says that your probability of bankruptcy increases by 2%, conditional on your type, a bunch of other stuff. And a delta of 0 is going to indicate 0 convergence. And so this specification, what we like about it is it produces economically interpretable parameters, also controlling for 10-year age bins in the specification, robust standard errors clustered by origin and destination commuting zone. All right, so the identifying assumption, I'm glad we've already sort of had a brief discussion of this. The identifying assumption is that conditional on controls, delta is uncorrelated with changes in the outcome that would have occurred if you moved to a different place with a different delta. Right, so this is just the orthogonality condition. The natural concern here is unobservable shocks. You move to a more distressed location because of a negative shock to you. You lose your job, you move to a place with worse outcomes. You move to a place with better outcomes in response to a better shock. Right? So the first thing to notice is that this would generate upward bias in the place-based effect. Right? If you move to places with worse outcomes because something bad happened to you, then that unobservable bad thing, right, is going to load on delta. And so that's going to bias that coefficient up. I already previewed the results, and I already showed you our bottom line finding is that there's actually very small place effects. So I think this natural form of bias works against our results. But of course, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of evidence that has given us confidence that this research design is valid. And hopefully will give you confidence as well, though everybody is free to make their own judgments. The first is that I'm going to show you that there are no trends in outcomes prior to the move. I'll do this by plotting I will do this with bin scatter plots of pre-move changes in outcomes against the delta. I'll do this by showing you event studies and show you that basically the coefficient on delta only starts to move away from 0 after the move and then gradually converges to sort of a new steady state. That's one thing I'm going to show you. A second thing I'm going to do is isolate different subsets of the variation that eliminate certain specific forms of concern. So for example, one specific concern you might have is of a origin-specific shock. Right? Everybody in Detroit is leaving because the auto industry was going to hell. And so that is going to contaminate the results. One way we can deal with that is we can not use the fact that people were leaving Detroit, but we can look at moves from the same place to different locations. So people who move from Detroit to Chicago versus Atlanta. Right? So isolate variation within people who move from the same place. The way we're going to do this econometrically is we're going to control for origin zip by event time fixed effects. So we're going to fully soak up the path of outcomes of everybody leaving a certain zip code. That's going to load on the fixed effects. And so the delta is then going to capture any differences in outcomes among people who leave the same zip and go to other places. And we can also construct, basically, we can isolate the complementary evidence. We can say, well, let's look at people moving to Atlanta, either from other places in the South without outcomes versus, let's say, people in the upper Midwest. And the way we're going to basically look within moves to the same place is with the same approach. And so this, I think, eliminates concern. If you think there's important bias from some shock which draws everybody to one place, say there's some booming housing market, or like, it's a better example, there's a flurry of job opportunities in South Dakota because of fracking, right? That's going to condition on that. And so we're going to look at people who move to South Dakota from different places. South Dakota is not a good example because it's very small. It's not going to drive the results, but hopefully you get the point. Okay, so some other things we're going to do. We will examine sensitivity, like I said, to using narrower and broader definitions of this delta. Should be an I subscript, not an R. There's a trade-off. So I would like to define delta as narrowly as possible because I'm capturing that person's specific experience of place. Like, what are the average financial outcomes among people, let's say, of their age who live in their zip code? The problem is if I start slicing and dicing the data too finely, my measurement of delta is going to be really noisy. So I'm going to show you results that use our baseline measure, which is just your zip code. I'm going to use zip code by 10-year age group. That's going to be narrower. I'm going to use broader measures, such as the county and the community zone. I think our qualitative results are broadly similar. You'll see once we get down to the zip by 10-year age group, some of the results are going to be attenuated towards 0, which I think is consistent with measurement error in our independent variable. The other thing we're going to do is examine sensitivity. Basically, another way to conduct this sort of exercise is estimate two-way fixed effects specification. So if you know sort of the labor economics literature on worker and firm effects, right, they're using two-way fixed effects specification. So here are the individual and place effects. So under certain assumptions, okay, so what is the two-way fixed effect specification? We're replacing this object which is the coefficients on delta with fixed effects for each commuting zone. And then we can look at, using these commuting zone fixed effects, we can attribute what is the share of outcomes that are determined by person versus these fixed effects. So we can do the same decomposition exercise. These approaches will produce identical results if two conditions hold. One, there is a measurement error in delta, and two, any heterogeneity in these coefficients are orthogonal to the deltas, right? So if there are heterogeneous effects, this is basically estimating, it's not a late, but you're going to be estimating the effect which is local to the variation you have, and that could be different from the effect where you're estimating these CZ fixed effects. But if there's no heterogeneity and there's minimal noise in delta, the effects will be the same. We do find similar effects, and we prefer this event study specification because I can show you plots which look at pre-trends. And so I think that's a huge advantage of this approach when you can pull it off, which seems to be okay in our situation. Okay, so let me show you a little bit of evidence, which hopefully will start to convince you that our research design is not crazy. So here on the x-axis is our measure of delta, the size of the move. So if you move from Minneapolis to Atlanta, this is a big value. On the y-axis, I'm showing the pre-move trend in the outcome. So I'm looking at financial distress 1 year before the move minus financial distress 3 years before the move. So if people were on pre-existing trends, if people who are moving to places with better outcomes were already getting better, right, you would expect this thing to be upward sloping. These lines are pretty flat. And in particular, they're flat relative to, these are now bin scatters, which have the same x-axis as before, but are now showing you the post-move minus pre-move change in the outcome. Right, so this is already some non-parametric evidence that there doesn't seem to be any changes in the outcome prior to the move, but there is a change in the outcomes in the years after the move. The event studies will provide much sharper evidence. Okay, some other things. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I said this is just the number of non-movers used to calculate the deltas. Our baseline is the zip. So there are 3,000 people in the typical group we use. But at the left tail, there's not many people, so especially for bankruptcy, where it's sort of a 1.5% effect. We're not estimating these effects off a lot of people. So I would place more weight on the county results for those outcomes. Great. So if there are no more questions, let me start showing you some results. So here are event study estimates for the effect on debt and collections. And to remind you about the interpretation, a coefficient of 0 indicates a place space effect of 0. And in the pre-period, right, if the coefficient was not 0, we'd see this sort of as a failed sort of research design track. A coefficient of 1 would indicate people fully converge to outcomes in the new place, or that they jump by as much as the difference in outcomes. What you see here is that, basically on impact, there seems to be, if you move to a place where people have more debt and collections, you start having more debt and collections, but it stabilizes at about 10%. If you break debt and collections into medical debt and collections or non-medical debt and collections, you see different patterns. And so in particular, what you see is that place seems to matter for medical debt and collections. And so that's consistent with either the collection practices of hospitals mattering. If you move to a place where hospitals are really aggressive in billing people and then sending those bills to collections, well, you're going to have more medical debt and collections. So that's consistent with, it's not driving at all. Like a big determinant of whether you have medical debt and collections is also, do you pay your bills? Do you have health insurance? Are you healthy? So person does matter, but place seems to matter, probably 20% of what's going on. For non-medical debt and collections seems to be, almost zero place-based effect. Right. So here are analogous plot for being late on your credit card. And again, very similar small effects, maybe 10% convergence when you move to a place where there's higher credit card non-payment rates.
Excuse me, but here it shows some pre-trend, right? For this graph.
Yeah, exactly. So here, this is a marginally significant pre-trend. If, I don't know, actually it's in the paper, we did it at some point. If you take out a pre-trend here, the effect would actually come down. My view is, if your prior, I don't know what my prior was, but if your prior is, 50% place, 50% person, no amount of small specification error is going to make this line go up to 50%. And so I think the qualitative result is fairly robust as an economic matter. If you gave me infinite data, even a small pre-trend is going to be statistically significant. So I think it's useful to think about the economics here. All right. So here are regression estimates. I guess I'm plotting the event study coefficient at 6 years after the move, because sort of 6 years? 24 quarters is about where things stabilize. So this shows you, again, sort of the fairly small effects for these outcomes. These rows conduct the exercise of looking within people who move from the same origin by fully flexibly controlling for origin by event time fixed effects, or by looking at people who move to the same destination. So we're basically partialing out half of the variation for both these exercises. And the results are similar, right? They bounce around like empirical results do, but I see them as fairly similar. And these are the estimates which use different measures of delta. So delta constructed at the zip code by age group level, delta constructed at the county level, delta constructed at the CZ level. And when we're changing across these specifications, two things are changing. One is we have more precise estimates. Two is we are measuring somebody's experience of place very differently. So, is my place defined by the default rates in Palo Alto or in the Bay Area, right? Those are very different. What's the right measure? It's probably something more localized, but it might not be super localized. But broadly speaking, I think my view here is that the place-based effects for these outcomes are small.
I want to ask a clarification question. I guess
Please.
it might be a stupid question. So when you control for the destination fixed effect, then a lot of place-based factors are gone, right?
Yeah, so I'm, just to be crystal clear, I'm controlling for destination by event time fixed effects. So I'm basically taking out a non-parametric trend for, let's say, everybody who moves to Palo Alto or everybody who moves to Beijing. And so then all my effects are identified off. I need at least 2 people who move to Beijing or to Palo Alto, and those people to come from places with different levels of delta. So you are right. And now I'm At some point, we did some exercise to make sure that we're not just completely, basically soaking up all the variation, and then our effects are identified off very few people. And we convinced ourselves that wasn't the case. And I don't remember the exact numbers now.
So when you say place-based effect, it's more about the destination's place-based effect, right? Or do you mean it also depends on where the original place is?
Yeah, so what I mean, so this is a good clarifying question. What I mean by placed effects is, so this delta is the average difference between your origin and destination. So if you move from a place, let's say with a 10% collections rate to a 20% collection rate, this variable is going to be 10%. And then the question is, this coefficient is going to capture, if this coefficient is 0.5, it says, when you move to a place with 10 percentage points higher default rates, your default rates increase 5 percentage points.
Okay, so it's a kind of a pair.
Exactly, it's based upon the difference, and this baseline specification is imposing a linear symmetric structure. If you move to places with better outcomes, your outcomes improve by some fixed proportion. If you move to places with worse, this coefficient again, says that relationship is proportionally constant, which doesn't have to be the case, but that is the baseline specification.
Okay, thank you.
No, that is if you're seeing this approach for the first time, or when I saw this for the first time, it took me a while to figure everything out. And so I actually, to help motivate writing this paper, I taught a movers paper to my PhD students for a couple of years. And after teaching it for a couple of years, now it's second nature to me. But like anything, you need to see it a couple times to fully understand what's going on.
And how do you think of the match component between individuals and places? It's assumed that the person effect and the place effect is additive, right? So
exactly. So our that's a very good question, and I'm not going to give you a good answer. We have an additively separable, or not this specification. When we do the two-way fixed effect specification, right? That's what I think the labor literature would call sort of no match effects, right? Additively separable place and person components which would be like the additively separable firm and worker fixed effects. And yeah, we haven't. Yeah, I am aware that in the labor literature, they do exercises to think about the match component. We haven't done those exercises, and I can't figure out right now off the top of my head whether the similar results we get for the event studies and for the two-way fixed effects would allow us to rule out a small or a large match component or not. So if somebody's smart enough to already know whether that provides information content, they should certainly tell me, but that is something that I need to spend more time thinking about. That's right.
Yeah, I think the labor literature, there some people look at, put a match component and find that the match component don't explain a lot of the variation. But yeah, but I'm not sure.
Part of the reason I think this is first order in the labor literature, and my excuse for not doing much here, is in like a Roy model, you would expect that match component to be very important, right? People are basically selecting jobs based upon the maximizing the firm worker surplus, whereas in our setting, we don't think that moves are being driven by financial distress, which, while the numbers are high, are still a 5% increase in the probability of collections is a couple $100, right? 5% of the $1,400. So we don't think there's any economic reason why there'd be a match component here. And now there could be a match component because of something else. But I don't think that's the first economic modeling right now. So that's a defense. I'm making it up as we go. You cannot believe me, but that's what I have.
It's fair enough.
Okay, so I showed you small effects. Right, and I think one nice thing about this specification is that, right, the interpretation of these effects, now that we've had this conversation, right, there's a good economic interpretation of these effects, right? 0 is no place component, 1 is place explains everything. I don't know if it's useful to compare across contexts, but like in healthcare, we find that the place component is 1/2. 1/2 of healthcare costs are being driven by place. I'm trying to remember. I think mortality is like closer to 0.3. So here are the effects for bankruptcy, and you see, in contrast to our results for collections, you do see a pretty big place-based effect for Chapter 7 bankruptcy and for Chapter 13 bankruptcy. If you move to places with higher bankruptcy rates, your probability of filing for bankruptcy, basically closes about 1/3 of that gap. So here again are our baseline estimates, sort of similar estimates, same origin. If we control for those, or we isolate people moving from the same origin and the same destination, actually see quite a bit of heterogeneity. These effects are really tiny. If you look at the zip by age group level, that's because our delta is just measured with a ton of noise, because bankruptcy is an infrequent outcome. Even a little bit bigger at the county or CZ level. So that's suggesting to us that actually the right level of aggregation for this outcome is probably a little bit higher than our baseline. So that's, the first big contrast is that the way you get into financial distress, collections, not paying your credit card, that's driven by person effects. The way you get out of financial distress, bankruptcy, that's driven by, are there lots of ads on the radio, billboards on the side of the road, which are telling you about bankruptcy. That's a feature of the place. So something we can do, I'll first present the first thing that provided us with some results, and I'll tell you about a bunch of rabbit holes we went down and we didn't find anything. So one way to shine light on mechanisms is to look at heterogeneity by the direction of the move. And so I'm going to define a move as positive if you move to a place with higher financial distress. I realize it's a weird use of the term positive, but that's just this delta thing is a positive number. I'm going to define a move as negative if you move to a place with lower financial distress. And as I mentioned in the introduction, informational theories predict basically asymmetric larger impacts for positive moves. If you learn about bankruptcy when you move to places with higher bankruptcy rates, and you don't unlearn when you move to places with lower bankruptcy rates, then you would expect this, or the estimates in this sample, to be bigger than the estimates in that sample. I should say this is not the only interpretation of asymmetry. So for example, a debt trap model, if it's easier to get into financial distress than get out, you would expect bigger effects for places with higher bankruptcy because you get into trouble than moves for places with lower bankruptcy because it's harder to get out of trouble. But we do think this asymmetry is informative. And so, we do this analysis for all of our outcomes. And I think for chapter 13, basically see the largest absolute difference and probably the largest proportional, maybe not, but certainly the biggest difference in economic terms between positive moves and negative moves. So basically most of the bankruptcy effect is people moving to places with higher bankruptcy rates and are more likely to declare bankruptcy. If people move to places with lower bankruptcy rates, they're less likely to declare, but that effect is much more muted. That coefficient is less than half as much. So, and like I said, that's consistent with these sort of informational legal culture stories. Another thing we looked at in Raj and Nate Hendren and co-authors' work on neighborhood effects, they found very strong exposure effects. And in fact, basically the first modern movers paper is a paper by Matt Getzkow and JP and Bart Bronnenberg, which is looking at the long-run impacts of advertising. They also find very large exposure effects, that the more you live in a place, let's say you grew up in a place where people drink Budweiser rather than Miller Lite, and then you move to a place where everybody drinks Miller Lite. Over the course of 20 years, you basically gravitate towards drinking Miller Lite, and that process is basically faster if you've been exposed to Budweiser for longer. So, we also look at this. I think we don't have a huge amount of power, basically because people are not, well, this is not like schooling where you can look at whether somebody spent, like 5 years in a high school or 1 year in a high school. But we can split the sample by whether people move when they're young or when they're old. And there's basically nothing. There are no economically or statistically significant differences in our outcomes. We can play around with different cut points, but there are no really interesting patterns. A second thing that we spent a lot of time doing, but that didn't bear any fruit, is what you can do is you can recover place-based effects using a two-way fixed effects specification. So that's what we did. Particularly, we recovered place-based effects at the state level. So we estimated outcomes on individual fixed effects and state level fixed effects, and those are identified by people who move across states. We took those 50 or 51 state level coefficients, and then we regressed them on state level factors. So legal factors, which might determine defaults of the generosity of bankruptcy, wage garnishment, measures of credit supply, economic factors. And somewhat surprisingly to us, we basically just got mushy zero. And so, our interpretation of that, I think, one interpretation of that is that, I guess two interpretations. One is we don't have any causal variation in these legal factors. So even though, we were taking state-specific estimates and projecting them on legal factors, states have many different things. And so, the relationship between the state fixed effects and the legal factors may be noised up by other confounds. I think the other thing we realized, which we knew but became more salient, is that the direction of these relationships is often theoretically ambiguous. So, for example, more consumer-friendly bankruptcy laws lead to consumers conditional on the amount of debt want to declare bankruptcy more, but lenders want to lend to them less. So how these offsetting supply and demand effects net out is theoretically ambiguous, and so zero effects don't really teach us much. We also found that there are these sort of non-monotonic relationships in the data, for example, between bankruptcy and income, which again sort of make these exercises difficult to interpret. So I think the bottom line is, like, we were hoping to see something, but the absence of evidence here doesn't really tell us much about different theories, because the theories don't actually make super strong predictions, especially when you don't have causal variation. So I have a discussion and a closing slide. So let me try and go through that, and then I can take some more questions. So the discussion, the small place-based effects for collections and credit card non-payment, tells us that these place-based factors, state laws, local economic conditions, lending supply, while you might be able to find statistically significant effects of them, they seem to not explain the vast majority of the patterns we see. Instead, right, the fact that people take basically their financial distress rates with them when they move suggests that persistent individual characteristics, preferences, behavioral factors, financial literacy are very important. On the other hand, for bankruptcy, it seems like the place is important. In particular, you go to places where people declare a lot of bankruptcy, you learn about it, and you're more likely to declare bankruptcy. That is consistent with prior research by Senator Warren, among others. So what did we do? We had this, what I think is a great data set. We documented these large persistent differences. We used a movers design to learn about the importance of place versus person-based factors. For bankruptcy, sizable place-based effects. For collections and default, individual effects seem to be very dominant. What I take away from this is, I think, it's convenient to write papers about institutional factors. Right? What's the effect of some bankruptcy reform in one state versus another state on some outcome? What's the effect of some, I will certainly be the editor for dozens of papers which are saying, what's the effect of like a bigger COVID shock in some places versus another, or lockdowns in some places versus another on some outcome? Certainly those things matter. Statistically significant place-based effects. But I think if we want to understand the vast majority of the variation, we also need to look to these persistent person-based characteristics. That's really hard to do. Very hard for me to causally figure out how important risk preferences, default stigma, discount rates are for determining all these outcomes, but it does seem like persistent individual characteristics are explaining the vast majority of what's going on. And so if we don't understand it, we're going to be sort of missing the proverbial elephant in the room.